Tears burned in my son's eyes as he clutched his cheek, his small fingers trembling against the red, swelling mark where she had struck him. I barely had time to process what I was seeing before her voice cut through the air like a blade. "You little brat, you dare to slam the door in my face." The woman, standing on my porch with wild eyes and flushed skin, wasn't just angry. She was unhinged. My heart pounded, so hard it felt like my ribs might crack from the pressure. My 12-year-old son, Ethan, had just been assaulted by a complete stranger. And the worst part, she wasn't done. "I'm calling the police. You've kidnapped that child, and I'm taking my house back." My breath hitched. This wasn't just some random act of rage. This woman was delusional, and I was about to be caught in the middle of something far worse than I could have imagined. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. The day had started out like any other. Moving into a new home was exhausting, but we were excited for a fresh start. The house was still mostly in boxes, and my husband was at work, leaving just Ethan and me to run errands. We spent hours at the grocery store, buying everything we needed to restock an empty kitchen. I hadn't realized how much time it would take until my feet ached from walking through every aisle, and my arms felt ready to give out from loading and unloading heavy bags. Ethan had been a trooper the whole time, pushing the cart, grabbing items, and helping me carry things to the car without a single complaint. By the time we finally pulled into our driveway, both of us were beyond exhausted. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard as we started bringing in the bags. Ethan was making trips back and forth in the car while I stayed inside, unpacking as quickly as I could. My mind was so focused on getting everything put away that I didn't even notice the back and forth pattern had stopped. At first, I assumed Ethan had just gone to grab something else from the trunk. But as the minutes stretched on, an unsettling silence crept through the house. "Ethan?" I called out, setting down a box of cereal. No answer. A sudden, loud bang at the front door made my entire body jolt. My heart skipped a beat as I turned toward the entrance. It wasn't just a normal knock. It was the kind of pounding that sent a clear message. Whoever was outside wasn't knocking out of politeness. Before I could even react, Ethan came racing inside, slamming the door behind him, his face pale as a ghost. He looked up at me, wide-eyed, chest heaving, before gripping the doorknob with both hands. "Mom, don't open it," he gasped. "She's crazy." "What? Who?" Another bang, this time even louder, as a woman's voice shrieked from outside. "Open this door. You have no right to be in MY house." My pulse skyrocketed. I rushed toward Ethan, grabbing his shoulders. "What's going on? Are you okay?" Ethan swallowed hard, his hand still gripping the door as if his life depended on it. She said this is her house. She told me you weren't my real mom and that I had to let her in." His voice wavered as he shook his head, his breath coming out uneven. "She tried to push past me, Mom. I didn't know what to do. I just slammed the door and locked it." A cold chill ran through me. The sheer absurdity of the situation made my head spin. Who the hell was this woman? And why was she acting like she owned our house? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, but the anger bubbling beneath the surface was almost unbearable. Before I could speak, the woman outside started screaming again. "I'm calling the cops. You're squatting in MY home, and I'll have you thrown in jail." I clenched my jaw, exhaling sharply through my nose. "Ethan, go to your room and lock the door. Do not come out until I tell you it's safe." "But now," my voice left no room for argument. I could hear the woman still ranting outside as I peeked through the peephole. She was middle-aged, with a sharp nose and short blonde hair, her face twisted in outrage. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to swing the door open and demand answers. But I knew better than to engage with someone this unstable. If she had already laid hands on my son, who knew what else she was capable of? A flicker of movement caught my eye. She was pulling out her phone. Oh, great. She was actually calling the police. My hands balled into fists. This wasn't just some entitled neighbor causing a scene. This woman was trying to turn the law against us. I had no idea who she was or why she thought she had a claim on my home, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. The wail of sirens echoed down the street, and my stomach twisted into knots as flashing red and blue lights flooded through the windows. The woman outside, whoever she was still ranting and pacing like a caged animal. But now she had a triumphant smirk stretched across her face. I took a step back from the door, my heart hammering as two officers climbed out of their patrol car and made their way toward my porch. My mind raced through the events of the last few minutes, trying to piece together the right words to explain that this woman was the aggressor, that she had assaulted my son, that she was the one trespassing and making false claims. But deep down, a sickening worry gnawed at me. What if they didn't believe me? Ethan was still in his room, safely locked away as I had told him. I had to handle this on my own. A sharp knock rattled the door. "Police, ma'am." "Open up." The voice was firm, authoritative, but not aggressive. Still, I hesitated. I didn't trust the woman outside, and I sure as hell didn't trust whatever lies she had spun to these officers. But keeping the door shut wouldn't do me any favors, so I exhaled slowly and pulled it open. Immediately, Karen, the name fit her too perfectly, stepped forward, pointing an accusing finger at me, her face contorted in an expression of fake distress. "That's her. She broke into my house and stole my son." Her voice trembled with manufactured outrage as she turned to the officers. "You have to arrest her. I have been trying to get inside, but she's locked me out." One of the officers, a tall man with sharp eyes, lifted a hand to silence her. "Ma'am, we'll get to the bottom of this. Please step aside." He turned his attention to me, his expression unreadable. "Can you explain what's going on here?" I opened my mouth, but Karen cut him before I could get a single word out. "She's a squatter. She must have broken in while the house was on the market. I never saw a sold sign. And that poor child," she gasped dramatically, shaking her head. "I think she's holding him hostage." My blood ran cold. The sheer insanity of what she was saying made my head spin. But what terrified me the most was the way the officer's eyes darkened at the mention of a child being in danger. "That is my son," I said firmly, fighting to keep my voice steady. "And this is my house. I can prove it." One officer, a younger man with a clipboard, shifted his weight. "Do you have identification? A lease or mortgage papers?" "Yes, of course," I said, already turning to grab them from the dining table where I had left them earlier. As I moved, I heard Karen's breath hitch in an almost giddy way, like she was savoring the chaos she was causing. My hands shook as I grabbed the papers, my mind racing through the possibilities. If she was willing to make a scene like this, she had to be delusional. But what if she had something up her sleeve? I handed the documents over, watching the officers closely as they examined them. The older one nodded slowly. "This does appear to be legitimate." But Karen wasn't done. "No, no, no. That has to be fake. This was my second home. I was in the process of claiming it under squatters' rights." One of the officers sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Ma'am, that's not how squatters' rights work. You can't just claim an unoccupied house as your own." Karen's face twisted with frustration. "But I was going to move in. No one was living here, and it was just sitting empty. That's not fair." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of her argument, but before I could say anything, Ethan's voice rang out from behind me. "Mom." He had cracked the door to his room. Peeking out cautiously, his face still marked with the red welt from where Karen had struck him. The moment Karen saw him, she changed tactics, her fake anger melting into false concern. "There you are, sweetie," she cooed, taking a step forward. "Come to Mommy." Ethan flinched, his eyes darting to me in panic, and something inside me snapped. "Do not take another step toward my child," I said coldly, stepping between them. The younger officer's gaze flickered between us. "Ma'am," Did she put her hands on him? I exhaled sharply. Yes. She slapped him across the face when he wouldn't let her inside. A tense silence followed. Then Karen scoffed, rolling her eyes. Oh, come on. He was being disrespectful. Kids these days think they can just slam doors in adults' faces. I was disciplining him. The officers exchanged glances, and the energy in the room shifted. The older officer's jaw tightened, and his hand moved to his radio. Dispatch, we need additional units here. Karen's confidence wavered, but she quickly masked with another burst of rage. Are you kidding me? I was protecting my property and my child, and you're taking her side. The officers weren't listening to her anymore. The younger one was already writing something on his clipboard, while the other officer gestured for her to step back. Ma'am, you're under investigation for assaulting a minor and filing a false police report. Karen's mouth fell open in shock. You can't do this to me. I was just trying to do the right thing. I placed a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder, my heartbeat finally beginning to slow. The nightmare wasn't over yet, but for the first time since this insanity had begun, I felt a flicker of hope. Karen's face twisted into an ugly snarl as she realized the officers were no longer blindly siding with her. The entitled confidence she had strutted onto my porch was beginning to crack, but she wasn't ready to give up. You don't understand, she screeched, pointing wildly at me and Ethan. This woman is a liar. That's my house. That's my child. I should be pressing charges against her for kidnapping and trespassing. Her voice had taken on a desperate, unhinged edge, and I could see the flicker of unease pass between the officers. They weren't fully sure what kind of person they were dealing with yet, but I knew exactly what she was, a delusional, entitled nightmare who had convinced herself she could twist reality to fit whatever fantasy she had concocted. But the truth was beginning to work against her, and she could feel it. The officer with the clipboard finished writing his notes before glancing toward me again. Ma'am, can you provide any additional proof of ownership? Maybe a utility bill, ID with this address, anything? I nodded quickly, relieved they were actually listening now. Yes, absolutely. Just give me 1 second. As I turned toward the kitchen, I saw Karen take a sharp breath, her hands curling into fists. I could see the realization dawning in her eyes. She was losing control of the situation. That's when she did something that made my blood run cold. The moment my back was turned, she lunged. A blur of movement, a sharp, panicked gasp from Ethan, and suddenly, Karen was shoving past the officers, making a wild grab for my son. Come here, baby. I'm getting you away from this monster, she shrieked, fingers outstretched as if she could just take him and run. For a split second, my entire body froze in disbelief. But the officers were faster. Ma'am, step back. One of them barked, moving between her and Ethan just as she reached for him. Karen screamed in frustration as the younger officer grabbed her arm, yanking her back before she could touch him. Get your hands off me. You don't understand. He's mine. He's mine. Her shrill voice pierced the air as she thrashed against their grip, twisting and turning like a rabid animal. Ethan had pressed himself against the wall, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear. I rushed to his side, pulling him close as he trembled against me. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over the roar of blood in my ears. This woman had actually tried to kidnap my son. If the officers hadn't been here, if they had hesitated even a second longer, what would she have done? Would she have dragged him away kicking and screaming? Would she have hurt him? The thought made my stomach churn. Ma'am, you're under arrest for attempted kidnapping, assault on a minor, and filing a false police report, the older officer said firmly, as he and his partner wrestled Karen into handcuffs. She let out a furious, high-pitched wail, struggling against them, but it was useless. The moment the cuffs locked around her wrists, her entire demeanor shifted. The rage drained from her face, replaced by wide-eyed shock. Wait, no. You don't understand. I have rights. This is my house. This is my child. You're making a mistake. She turned toward me, her expression contorting into something almost pitiful. Please. You have to understand, I needed this house. You can't do this to me. I felt a surge of disgust as she spoke. She needed this house? What about me and my family? What about the fact that my son had been assaulted and terrified in his own home because of her insanity? She didn't care about anyone but herself, and she never had. I tightened my grip on Ethan, glaring at her with every ounce of fury I had left in me. You put your hands on my son, I said, my voice like ice. There is nothing you can say that will make that okay. Karen's mouth opened as if she wanted to argue, but the officers were already dragging her toward the patrol car. Her shouts became more incoherent the farther she got, and soon, the only sound left was the distant hum of sirens in the night. I finally exhaled, my shoulders sagging as the adrenaline began to wear off. I looked down at Ethan, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. Are you okay, sweetheart? I asked gently. He nodded slowly, though his hands were still trembling. I'm okay, he whispered, then hesitated. Mom, what if she comes back? I swallowed hard, forcing down the wave of anger and fear that threatened to rise up again. She won't, I promised. We're going to make sure of that. The officers returned a moment later, the younger one looking at me sympathetically. We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to give a full statement. But from what we've seen here, she won't be bothering you again. We'll also be issuing a restraining order. I nodded, relief washing over me. Thank you. As the police car pulled away, taking Karen with it, I let out a long, shaky breath. It was over, or at least, the worst of it was. The house still felt tense, filled with the echoes of what had just happened. But we were safe, and for now, that was enough. The quiet that settled over the house after Karen was taken away felt unnatural, almost eerie, as if the walls themselves were still holding their breath. I stood there in the entryway with Ethan, neither of us speaking for a long time. His small fingers clung to my arm, his grip just a little tighter than usual, and I could still feel the slight tremor in his body. My heart ached at the thought of what he had just gone through. A 12-year-old boy should never have to be afraid in his own home. He should never have to wonder if some stranger is going to storm in and try to take him away. The thought of what could have happened if the police hadn't been there in time made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to push it aside. He was safe. We were safe. That was what mattered now. I took a deep breath and gently squeezed his hand. Why don't you go wash up, sweetheart? Then we'll order some takeout. Anything you want. Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the door as if half expecting it to burst open again, but then he nodded and shuffled toward the bathroom. I watched him go, my chest tightening. This was supposed to be a fresh start for us, a new home, a new neighborhood. Instead, we had been thrown into chaos before we even had a chance to settle in. I had hoped for friendly neighbors, for a peaceful adjustment into our new life. Instead, we had gotten her. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence as I absent-mindedly put away the last of the groceries, my mind still reeling. It wasn't just the fact that she had come onto my property, screamed at me, and tried to break in. It wasn't even just that she had called the cops on me, fully expecting to have me dragged out in handcuffs. It was the sheer insanity of it all. The way she had convinced herself that she was entitled to my home, my son, my life. What kind of person wakes up one day and decides to steal someone else's existence like that? Even now, it didn't seem real. My phone buzzed on the counter, pulling me out of my thoughts. I grabbed it quickly, my heart racing, but it was only my husband checking in. I exhaled slowly before answering. Hey, the concern in his voice was immediate. Hey, how's everything going? Did you two get home okay? I hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Ethan had disappeared. I debated for a moment whether to tell him everything over the phone, but there was no use sugarcoating it. He needed to know. Something happened, I said, my voice lower now, as if saying it out loud made it more real. I could almost hear him sitting up straighter. What do you mean? What happened? So I told him everything. The entitled woman, her insane claims, how she had hit our son, how she had called the police on me and tried to kidnap Ethan right in front of them. By the time I finished, the silence on the other end of the line was heavy, filled with barely contained rage. She did what? His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the fury simmering beneath the surface. Is Ethan okay? Are you okay? We're fine now, I assured him, though my own nerves were still rattled. The police arrested her. She's gone. Gone for now, he muttered, clearly unsatisfied. We need to make sure she doesn't come back. We need cameras, security, a restraining order. We're already getting one, I said quickly. The officers told me they'd put it through immediately. He let out a sharp breath. Good, but I still don't like this. What if she gets out on bail? What if she tries something else? That was a thought I had been trying to push away. But of course, it had been lurking there, just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment I let my guard down. I wanted to believe that this was over, that Karen would rot in jail for what she did. But realistically, I knew better. People like her didn't just go away that easily. I swallowed hard, gripping the phone tighter. We'll be careful, I promised. I won't let her near Ethan again. After we hung up, I stood there for a long time, staring at the phone, trying to steady my breathing. It was strange how, even with her gone, she still left behind this invisible presence, this lingering sense of unease. It wasn't until Ethan came back into the kitchen, rubbing at his damp face, that I forced myself to shake it off. He looked up at me hesitantly. Can I pick my room color now? It was such a simple question, but the normalcy of it made my chest tighten. He needed this. He needed something to ground him, something to remind him that this was his home, and no one could take that away from him. I smiled, reaching out to ruffle his hair. Of course, Spud. Any color you want. For the first time that evening, he smiled back. A real one. And just like that, I knew we were going to be okay. We weren't going to let one insane, entitled woman ruin this for us. This was our home, our fresh start, and no one, not even Karen, was going to take that away from us.